Jason, appreciate you hopping on today. You're the first guest we've had on. You were, I think, number 2, and now we're at 202, I believe, or somewhere around there. So pretty cool on both sides, and excited to hear the progress and what Sportsvisio and yourself are up to.
Yeah, I look forward to coming back in 404 and
Yeah.
keeping the cycle alive. When you're old and gray, still doing this.
As much as I love to hear that, at the same time, it's like, wow, that's a lot to go. But in a good way, I enjoy these. So yeah, give us an update. What was Sportsvisio when we first talked, right? I believe this was 2 years ago. You're just getting off the ground. And to
Yeah,
what is it today? Where are you guys at? And we'll take it from there.
yeah, sounds great. Yeah, I think I shared some of my story about growing up poor and starting a cybersecurity firm, and then I moved into investing, and then running for Senate, and then I started Sportsvisio almost three and a half years now. Took a couple of years to build the product. We launched, I think, right after the podcast, a few months later. So the time we were kind of in beta testing with some customers to use AI and computer vision to create stats, highlights, and analytics for sports automatically. We were going to market with basketball, which is the second largest sport after soccer. It's very technically challenging. We still don't have any true AI competitors in the mass market. I've got Second Spectrum doing some stuff with the NBA, but everybody else is still very manual. So yeah, we launched that following summer after the podcast, and we're slow growth that first year. We let go our head of sales and brought in a CRO, who was global director at marketing for marketing at Microsoft. 2024, we had explosive growth. So we did the hockey stick growth you want to see in a venture-backed company. And I think we closed the year with 11 or 12,000 users, 50 or 60x growth from where we started in 2023. And we're pushing $1 million in ARR, and this year we should be at like 2.5. So we've got a bunch of 6-digit accounts now, dozens of smaller programs, everything from small high schools to colleges to AU clubs to tournaments and semi-pro and large leagues like Lifetime Fitness and Equinox and other groups like that, crossover. Yeah, it's been really fun building a coaches premium for the more competitive programs to give like plus minus analysis, lineup, shot charts, heat maps, AI analysis, player premium, and also launching volleyball this quarter. So that's a big, exciting development. We've got a big, large tournament program. That's a 6-digit account for us that we're going to be launching with, and then also signing up a bunch of clubs. So it's been exciting. We've done some work in baseball. We have an API product. Obviously, I spoke at RacketX on the future of AI and racket sports. So we've done a little bit of work there, but, trying to stay focused. So there's, it's fun and exciting with AI. You've got all this cool tool and you see hammers everywhere, but we're trying to not try to boil the ocean and stay focused on, building out basketball and volleyball, and then we'll take on other sports over time.
Love that. And AI's evolved a lot too since you first started. What was, just from a macro, where artificial intelligence, machine learning, that whole space was when you first began 3.5 years ago to where it is today? Like, has a lot of that changed, even both internally and externally?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's funny because when we started, we still built all the AI in-house ourselves. Our CTO is a colleague of mine at DARPA. He's got 18 patents in AI research from IBM, Watson research team. He ran a $200 million portfolio of programs at DARPA. Our AI lead was chief scientist at BAE Systems North America, or had a 180-person AI department. So we were building stuff ourselves and expected to have to do that. And that's still the case, although the open source community is definitely, we're able to leverage a couple of algorithms that are helpful. But what's funny is Doug Higgins from Sapphire, when we put out the press release about our seed round, he talked about generative AI. And I'm like, pushing back. I'm like, yeah, we don't do generative AI. Doug, what are you talking about? We build our own computer vision. But that's not true anymore, because the reality is generative AI has gotten so good that we're doing a lot of cool stuff now around, like, we can do full game write-ups like a reporter. And we take all of our stats and analytics and JSON files about what happened in the game. We can feed that into an LLM. And seconds later, we get a nice game write-up as if the reporter was right there at the game talking about who did what. And so there's a lot of neat, really cool functionality that we didn't have to build in-house. You can just plug into an LLM and take advantage of the hard work we did of mapping out all of the things that happen in the game. And you can use an LLM to just add a whole bunch of layers of insight on top of that. So we've done some work with like enhancing the graphics of clips for content, insights into the game, write-ups for engagement. So yeah, generative AI is definitely adding a ton of value to the products we've already developed, and I think it's going to continue as we see that acceleration continuing in the community.
Yeah, and good timing as well, for sure. Now, when you think about going from basketball to volleyball, right? This is obviously a big step in any sports tech company. If you look at some of the biggest throughout that, and again, it's still in the early innings of the industry in general. But when you look at some of the ones that got bigger, a Sport Radar, a Genius Sports, whatever, they all really did start in one sport. But then it was how did they go to multiple, right?
Yeah.
How are you approaching that? Why volleyball as the next one? And what are some of those differences you see as you're starting to expand from just one sport to multiple?
Yeah. I mean, not surprisingly, we get a lot of demand for different sports. Everyone we talk to is like, oh, my kid plays football. Can you do football? Or I wrestled in college. Can you do that? We get those all the time. Volleyball was the one that we got the most demand from our paying customers. They were like, hey, we run an AU program for basketball, but we also do volleyball. Can you do that? We do tournaments. We had groups like Baller TV. They're like, we don't want to work with you unless you do both sports because we do so much in both that was kind of a requirement to work with them because they're like, we don't want to have 20 different partners. We want to really have one strong partner that can do a bunch of these key sports. And volleyball was the one that was super complementary, which makes sense, right? It's another indoor sport, often played in the same facilities. People with a tall son may have a tall daughter who plays volleyball. They tend to be bifurcated more heavily by gender. And so we were just seeing a ton of overlap. And then technically, it's also an easier problem than basketball because it's not a contact sport. You have each team stays on their own side of the court. They're kind of facing one way. You don't have the same degree of occlusion and obfuscation of the ball and player position and numbers. It was a lot easier to identify what's going on. So that kind of all those things combined to say this is probably the logical next sport to go after. And we'll continue to kind of build it out. And we're kind of going to let customers drive our next sports. We do see a lot of potential in soccer, but there's also a lot of competition there. But we have customers continue to ask, and they're still not happy with some of the options. So that's in the future. Obviously, we've done some stuff with tennis. We have a baseball product we built as an API with a partner. So we're trying to think, what do we do with that? That works today. We can take a photo of a paper book with a full box score and just video the tournament. We can do a full AI breakdown of all the video highlights of every player right now, but we're not even using that. So we're trying to figure out, is there a go-to-market partner who can, take advantage of that technology with us? So yeah, it's exciting. There's a lot of opportunity. Like you said, we're in the early days, and I bet a large chunk of my retirement money from my last company on this because I believe, there's a huge opportunity to be a, $100 million to $1 billion a year revenue business in this space, doing this kind of work.
Love that. And yeah, the skin in the game is so important. We won't go further into that, but it's always, good to see when the founders or people involved are
Yeah, for sure.
heavily in it, right? Now, you had mentioned earlier, and obviously I know Sean, but you bring in a new salesperson, right? Like a lot of companies in the space, like selling is such a huge piece, and there are nuances, right? And you're coming from tech, which there's some similarities, but there's a lot of differences even, right?
Oh,
Like what were some of those learnings even, or, why is Sean, the new CRO done so much better? And what have you learned sort of into selling into a lot of these properties, especially with a lot being in more the amateur space or the adult recreational space?
Yeah, I mean, I think, tons of learnings there. I mean, one of the biggest challenges I think we've had as a company, and I think you identified this when we were speaking early, was the fact that although we all knew sports as a consumer, we didn't know the business side and didn't have that network that some people do. And that really set us back in terms of the market adoption side. I think we knew enough about the industry from a technology product perspective to build a compelling product. But the go-to-market strategy, you really need those go-to-market partners to be successful in getting to scale. So it took time. It's like every business. Sports isn't unique, but it's a very relationship-driven business. And building those relationships has taken some time, but we've gotten that. Obviously, folks like you and your community in the Profluence group is a great example of ways that you can engage in the community. So a shout out to that group. But I think there's other Sapphire Sport led our round. I went to their LP meeting and I was meeting folks from the Pacers and the Celtics and Madison Square Garden ownership group and, other investor groups. So as we've built strong relationships and kind of executed on the product vision, we're starting to build those connections. And we just had the chairman of one of our large potential customers privately write a check, right? So that shows some potential when you get people that are that excited about what you're building, they want to come in, they help open up some doors. And the more we're sticking around and executing, the more people get excited and make those introductions. Sean didn't have that network either. He's just a guy who is excellent in what he does and does a great job tackling the problems and having a good process. And we have a great social media guy who's like tagging players and online. I think we had 1 million views on our Instagram content. So as we do that, the word is getting out, on the bottom side of like the users who are just like, man, this is awesome. How do I get this? And then we're getting the top down strategic partnerships of these large go-to-market partners where we can get 6 and 7 digit accounts and partnerships. So that kind of bimodal strategy of building content from the bottom and then those strategic partnerships on top where he and I are leading that has really, yielded fruit.
I love that. And something I want to call out too is obviously receiving and getting capital and getting people to buy in on an investor side is important, right? And you've gotten that side, right? But it all started from relationships. And I think you've done, if there's anything like I can commend, you've done a great job of like infiltrating and getting into the space. And, how did you approach that? Or how do you think about that, of whether it's conferences or getting people to really buy in before, even the numbers were there or it was where it wants to be? Like, how did you do that? Because I think there's so much other people can learn.
Yeah.
And it's never capital first. And everyone thinks that if I raised $1 million, I could have, but it's like, but you don't even have the foundation. So like, how do you even approach that, right? You're working out of Alumni Ventures office today. Like, what's your thought process of how you were like, hey, I'm going to go infiltrate and get to the center of sports so people can buy into the larger picture?
No, that's a great question. It was actually pretty fun for me because I felt like a 23-year-old kid again, going to Black Hat and DEF CON, these hacking conferences for the first time, where I'm this like newbie sitting there like, oh, wow, this is amazing. Like, look at these famous hacker people and I don't know anything. And, it took me 20 years of working in that industry to move from the bottom to the top where I was at DARPA, I was running this company. I know the guys keynoting these conferences now are personal friends. I know their marriage, their kids, their career story, how they got stabbed in the back at that last venture, and who's selling 0-day exploits on the black market and the gray market, and who does well. But it took a decade or two to get to that point. And here I am back in sports, going to a conference like, oh, look, there's JJ Redick at the Sloan Sports Conference, and these are all these like famous people. And I was like, I don't know anybody here. But it was kind of a fun back to school moment of like, all right, you're like, take it all away. It's like that guy dropped on an island. Can you prove it? Like, do you have what it takes? Right. So there's a little bit of that competitive fire of like, all right, let's see. Can I do this again in a different vertical? And so I think it was good for me as a guy who had an 8-digit exit and could sit by a pool all day the rest of my life to be like, take it all away. Let's see what you can do with this, right? And go off and be like, all right, let's get the competitive juice going and start and go with a playbook that I had done before, which is just, be kind, be respectful, be helpful to people. I'm an extrovert, so it was very easy for me when I go to conference, just walk up to people, say hi, start to get to know people, and you connect. I have a great story of, the philanthropy side. We donate most to a charity. I'm pretty passionate about impact, fighting human trafficking, all these kinds of things that some people connect to and others don't care, but might respect, the progress I had on the career side. So, or just a common love of the sport and solving technical problems. So you start to build a relationship, you help people out with no expectation in return. And then sometimes that turns into a favor for you and doors being opened. And it just kind of cascaded from there. So building, even you, like if you recall, the way I was on that first podcast is you wrote an article on AI in sports, and I read it and I found a bunch of gaps. And I was like, hey, you've got some really cool companies, but here are 8 companies that, you might not have seen that I had found in my own competitive research. And of course, mine was one of them, but I included a bunch of others. And sent it over, and you're like, oh, wow, this is really helpful. Thank you. Like, I'd love to talk, right? We have a phone call, and you're like, hey, I've got this podcast. Would you want to come on it, right? So I think that same approach of just helping other people with no expectation of return, people appreciate that, and it ends up paying dividends and building your network. And then if you execute and do things well, and they know they can trust you, then that leads to good things.
I agree. And from a fundraising perspective, obviously, right, you have a great cap table. How did you think about that, right? Because you've obviously seen that's important in sports as well. Like, it is very relationship based. And so who you ultimately take, like there's raising capital and then there's raising strategic, and who's like, it can make or break companies. How did you think about that as well? Because I know you've had people try to come in and take it and you've said no, and then on the flip,
Yeah.
like you found the right people, whatever, how do you approach that? Because and then it's that real team approach, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's raising capital is a whole discussion of itself. You could do a good podcast on, I'd say one thing that helped me a lot, and I'm a big fan of this in every vertical, is trying to, walk a mile in someone else's shoes, like the saying goes. When I was at DARPA, it was very helpful for me that I'd been in industry for 10 years before I went to DARPA, because I learned people in industry are like, oh, the government people suck, they're lazy, they punch out at 4:30, it's a bureaucracy. And then you get there and you realize there's amazing people, they're doing amazing work. And yeah, there's some bureaucracy and some rules, but there's some really hardworking, great people there. But on the government side, you realize they talk about the industry people and they're like, oh, they're all slimy and they're trying to take your money. And there's a lot of great, wonderful people that are just doing great work. But you have a lot more empathy and understanding for the constraints and the advantages of each dynamic. And I think being an investor, having been a founder, moving into investing, angel investing in a bunch of companies, it has helped me on the fundraising side because I now know what a great pitch looks like, right? I know what investors are looking for. And I also don't take it personally if someone says no, like, because I've said no hundreds or thousands of times. So I understand, like, yeah, there's so many factors that go into it, from timing to amount to stage to founder, investor fit to technology. And so you just have to pattern match and try to say, okay, what's the best fit for this group? And what are the things that they're looking for that I'm looking for? And not take it personally, and treat people again with respect, and kind of focus on building a good network and be helpful to those folks and make some introductions. And again, even being a founder, some of the investors I've met were through portfolio companies that I've invested in. And then I've tried to help them beyond just writing a check. And then they were like, oh, well, can I introduce you to some of my investors as you guys are raising money? So I think that's been super helpful. And then there's so many good resources online. I'm a big fan of Stefan Nasser's got a group called Open VC, and he's building a bunch of free resources for people to raise money, to connect to founders. There's so many great groups out there like that. Andrew Young has like a networking group, and he's organizing events around the US. He'll promote some companies, and he's shared about us. He actually invested in us. So there's groups like that are just doing great work and connecting people. And I think plugging into those communities and learning from others that have done it is such a compelling way to jumpstart. I know some friends are like, I like to learn the hard way. I got to learn it myself. I'm like, screw that. I'm all about learning from other people. And if you figured out, like, I don't want to do it the hard way, I'd rather do it the right way the first time, because I'm competitive and want to avoid failing if I can. I'll do it if I need to, but I'd much rather learn from others.
You know what? You brought up one thing. I know it's worth a longer discussion, but quickly, like, what does make the good pitch then, right? Like, what did you learn sitting on both sides of the table where you're now like, hey, here's how I know how to present Sportsvisio and what we're doing the best?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of people had asked me that, and I tell them I'm like 6 letters: CAC and LTV. Like, the number one reason I don't invest in sports tech companies is they just don't understand that concept. Like, every business can be boiled down to how much does it cost to get a customer and how much do you make on a customer. And there's so many sports tech companies like, oh, I'm going to build an app. I'm going to get coaches. They're going to pay me $100 a month for this biometric tracking thing. And then I'm going to keep them and I'm going to retain them for like 2 years and blah, blah, blah. No, you're not. Like, you're going to get them for 2-3 months. It's going to cost you $200 to land that customer, and they're paying you $80 a month, and they're turning, 6 weeks in. You have like a negative CAC to LTV ratio. Like, you don't have a business. You have a money burning pile that investors should run away from. But they just don't think that through. They just think, well, it's like the field of dreams. If I build it, they'll come. Like, I just build a cool thing and everyone's going to love it and sign up. And it's like, you don't think about the competition, the difficulty of attracting a customer, and the cost to get a customer, how hard it is to retain that customer, the competitive landscape. They kind of just start looking down, like, I got an idea and a thing, instead of looking out and saying, take that investor mindset first. Say, if I had $1 million, is this where I would want to put it? Who would I invest in the space? So we had looked, before I started the company, at everybody else who was out there. You got Swing Vision doing some cool stuff in tennis. Sports Logic was doing stuff in hockey. Trace and Veo were both hardware, but they were in soccer. You had Track 160. And I'm like, all right, so who's doing what? Second Spectrum in basketball, but they're only in the pro side. There's nothing really in the amateur market. And I was like, all right, I think there's a huge gap in the market here. That's where I'm going to go, and I'm going to put $500,000 into it. But if you start with that mindset, you know exactly where you fit. You can figure out where you're best in the world at and do that, and then articulate that to investors and think about that CAC to LTV and say, okay, do I have a business where I can spend a small amount of money and make a lot of money on each customer? And if you do, you've got a great business.
Yeah, and I love that. And from So you did the initial research. I'm curious now, like from and then you talked a little bit about sports tech and why you don't always love it from like when you put your investor hat on. Just mainly, it seems like it's actually a founder gap of how they're presenting a lot of it.
Yep.
What are you seeing? Like, what are you paying attention to in the space now from a macro? Like, while you're actively building, what's in your mind or where the space is going? You're obviously still probably doing research and thinking
Yeah,
about
yeah, and
what's
I still
coming and where it's
invest.
going.
I've got a couple of companies presenting tomorrow, actually. So yeah, I mean, we look at. I think the sports tech space, obviously, NIL has been big. So I think there's the professionalization of sports is moving lower levels, right? As you see college players now making millions of dollars, high school players are potentially going to college quicker, or even could get NIL deals that young. So what does that mean? There's more private equity money moving into the amateur market, more private equity stuff, roll ups in that space. So we look at that, and obviously AI is crossing every industry, particularly ones that are sleepier industries like sports that have historically not gotten the latest and greatest technology. My background in working in defense R&D and cybersecurity, those are bleeding edge, cutting edge technology centers. Sports has historically been more like ex-jocks, people doing stuff manually, writing some software to solve a problem. But I think as more money is flowing in, more attention and eyeballs are there, people are saying, wow, this is a great opportunity to leverage AI and computer vision technology to really change the way things have been done historically and disrupt those incumbents, which is kind of our focus.
Now, as you look to, you're adding volleyball. That's a big thing, right? Growing quickly. It seems like you have a lot of your internal team in place. You know, where are you looking from, over the next couple years, right? Like, is it to go add a bunch of different sports? Is it to go deeper in certain ones? What's sort of on the roadmap for Sportsvisio that gets you excited about internally where you want to go?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there's a constant tension. I have a little bit of ADHD, so I always see the new shiny object. And I know you and I have talked about like, oh, I want to go after this sport and that sport, but you need to focus, right? So I do think there's a bit of a land grab as technology companies are in the space and more companies are moving in. I just heard of another company trying to move into volleyball. Ball time is already out there doing highlights and then starting to move into stats. You have the incumbents like a Volumetrics doing manual stats and more expensive. But I think companies are trying to move into sports. So the question is, how much do we try to expand horizontally and expand into other sports while consolidating and deepening our position and adding new features our customers ask for in each vertical? And that's going to be a constant tension. I don't think there's an obvious answer of one way or the other. I think it's obvious you don't want to go too wide. And I also think it would not be wise to go too deep, right? If you're building, this complex feature for 1% of your customers that's costing you a large amount of money, like that's obviously a stupid decision. But on the flip side, if you're just really wide and but shallow and don't offer something great for each customer and don't deepen those relationships with each sport, you're also going to kill yourself with a lack of focus. So I think we're constantly going to be evaluating every 6 months and talking to advisors, and investors, and the board, and industry folks like yourself, and saying, "Hey, what are you guys seeing? What's the best opportunity?" I think our goal is probably to try to do one sport a year ish, but not be militant about that. If it's 18 months or if it's 9 months, right? It depends on how adjacent the sport is, how easy our go to market is, right? If we can go with a partner that maybe has a huge incumbent customer base and a front end and a back end, and they just need some cool AI, like that could be a 6 to 9 month effort. Or if we got to build something from scratch, like we did with volleyball, where we're doing the whole thing, like that was more like a 12 to 15 month effort. Obviously not all AI, but there's a longer process. You're trying to make sure you do it right and do a smooth launch and beta test and alpha test. And so I think it's evolving, and it's going to be a moving target as the industry evolves. We'll continue to evaluate that.
Yeah, and how much, like, I guess more personally on your side, but building the product versus building the vision, like how do you balance your time going to conferences, right, versus internal meetings? How are you balancing all of that at
Yeah.
this, heavy growth phase currently?
Yeah, I mean, it varies by season. Sometimes like right now we're raising a small round. So we've taken more than half of it. So I've been on the road. I was in New York last week meeting with investors, partners, like advisors. So I'm a little more outward focusing right now. We'll be closing that round probably in the next 6 to 8 weeks. After that happens, it'll be more internally focused of saying, okay, let's build, let's scale. How do we get this thing to 2-3 million in revenue this year? And as we do that, then it'll be pivoting back to we're going to raise the Series A, and after we do that, it'll be pivoting back to internal and say, how do we get to cash flow positive, which I think we can do partway through the Series A. And then we don't have to raise money anymore. And it's really kind of optional for just doing it for growth, which I think that'll be a really fun spot to be. So I think it's very seasonal, but I never want to be 100% internally or externally focused, right? I think you need a balance of both. Where listening to a podcast like yours or going to an event like the conference you were talking about, but also constantly talking to the team on Slack and in meetings about how they're doing, where the problems are, how we can solve them and move forward.
I love it. Yeah, and it's exciting. So, Jason, I appreciate you coming on today. It's always good to get the rehash and great to see, even as we have guests on early to where they go. And it'll be cool I'm actually going to go listen to the first one and then this one. And I think it'll be interesting to see if a lot of other people do as well to like, hey, what was said differently? Like, I think that's going to be cool. And we can put it through some AI and probably pull out the differences and where it went using some but, where can people learn more about Sportsvisio, website, socials? Where are you guys heavy right now? Where are you going to be from events or conferences where people can meet you?
Yeah, great question. So obviously the website, Sportsvisio, VISIO, which is Latin for vision. You can see the company. We're on socials from, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter. I'm pretty active on Twitter personally. So if anyone needs to reach me, that's probably the easiest way because anyone can follow me and shoot me a note. LinkedIn.
Was that just your name, Jason Syversen?
Yeah, exactly. I'm the only one out
SYVER?
there. Jay Syversen, I think, is my handle. I guess X they call it now. I am on LinkedIn as well, but I try to limit that to people I actually know. But happy to chat. Emails just jason@sportsvisio.com. And so folks can reach out. And then in terms of conferences, I think you mentioned a sports tech conference coming up will probably be part of that. I've been doing the Art Basel thing last couple of years. South by Southwest I might do. And, I was at the Racket X conference last year. I'll probably do something like that. And I might go to Europe actually because our CRO is in Ireland and he's trying to get me to attend one of the ones out there. So I might use that as a chance to hang out with him for a bit. But appreciate the opportunity to come by. It's always great to see what you're doing. I'm always sending folks your way. I'm like, hey, do you know Andrew Petcash? And they're like, oh, and actually Aaron from Will Ventures like, no, but I'm a big fan. I'd love to talk to him. So I'm like, oh, let me make an intro. So I always love making connections and what you're building.
I love it. I appreciate it, Jason. Well, good stuff. And hopefully on 404, we're like, holy cow, it's we were at the early days
Yes,
at this one.